we actually dedicate a really concerning amount of our response to dementia to just like tying people down. The idea of what that means in an online world where like wandering's actively encouraged for everyone, right? You're supposed to just keep scrolling and keep going down the rabbit hole. The lack of attention that's being paid to that is deeply worrying.
Welcome to the Research for Good podcast. My name's Professor David Ellis, and today I'm joined by Dr James Fletcher, who's an assistant professor in digital futures. Welcome.
Hello.
People listening will hear you say you're an assistant professor in digital futures. What do you mean by digital futures?
For me, there are sort of several aspects of that. I think one of the first things that always strikes people when I talk about digital futures is the fact that it's plural, right? So we don't say future, we say futures. I think that's really important because it speaks to like the nature of the future as something which right now is completely multiple. It could play out in so many different ways, and we will decide that effectively. I mean, not you or I, maybe, who knows what's going to happen. But people generally make futures. It's not just something that magically happens without anybody having acted. And actually that would be probably one of my criticisms of a lot of contemporary disciplinary sociology, is that often we're very good at saying, oh, look at all these big worrying problems, aren't they terrible, but not very good about thinking about how you then progress from that and get away from that, and we sort of strip everyone of their agency, whereas actually we will all decide the future. It doesn't happen by accident. A lot of our lives are increasingly dictated by digital technologies, but also the ways in which we age are dictated by digital technologies in really interesting ways. So one of the things that I was thinking about recently was the iPod. So I found my old iPod, right, which is actually from an era not very long ago, but also really ages me. Like my close relationship with an iPod Classic and everything that represented at the time of like music piracy, a really interesting period of time between, you know, the breakdown of CDs and the rise of Spotify and streaming. And it's super aging, right? There's this idea in gerontology of aging as migration through time. And so people can almost find themselves in quite unfamiliar environments simply by virtue of being around for a few years. And often I think that is sort of how we exist in relation to technology. We always sort of exist in relation to technologies and have a slight sense in which our own were better than everyone else. But that frantic pace of change is then really important because you then exist in relation to it in time, and it enables you to sort of anchor your own agedness. Like now I teach adults, right, like people who are above the age of 18, about social media, Friendster, MySpace, the really interesting creation of social media as we think about it today. These are adults who weren't born when those things were happening, but I remember that and lived that. And so that already via digital technologies that have been super important in shaping the whole world, it really places me in time and makes me like a certain type of aged subject.
And so perhaps that feeds nicely into your current work in the moment around AI and people in the workplace.
Yeah. And I think that one of the important things to state about that work is that people often, particularly for older people, by which we sort of loosely mean 65 plus, but that's a little bit arbitrary. There's a tendency for people to assume that you have a population of older people and then a population of people who engage with technology, and they don't really mix. Like we all have this idea about, you know, your nan who can't use a phone and that sort of stuff. A lot of my work, particularly on using new technologies to support older people to remain in work for longer, is first and foremost just trying to push back against those ideas. So we often call them digital ageism, this assumption that older people just don't engage with new technologies, which is really far from the truth. But it's a really important first step to doing that sort of work. And And we exist in a world where, for many reasons, governments would like older people to remain in work longer. All of the older people with dementia that I work with tell me stories about being kicked out of employment early. That's the typical trajectory for people diagnosed with dementia when they're in the workplace, and they would rather remain. They feel that they can remain and that they'd benefit from that. And really fortunately, it just so happens that in the same way that we've sort of long had disability assistance tools, you know, even in a very simple way, you might think of someone who maybe doesn't have legs and uses a wheelchair, and then if we install a ramp instead of stairs, then that completely changes their experience of that space and their ability to engage. Well, what digital technologies, information systems in particular, do is effectively a form of cognitive work. So it provides us with a suite of tools that can potentially allow us to help people who experience cognitive disabilities in the same way that we've sort of grown really accustomed to and familiar to helping people with physical disabilities.
Of course, in the same way, digital technology can also exclude and isolate, in the same way that a ramp can be installed for someone in a wheelchair, but it's too steep to get up.
Yeah.
So there's a balance there, right?
Yeah. There are many different things at stake there. So in the wheelchair analogy, often when we see things like that happening, it's because nobody was ever consulted on that. Somebody who is walking around and using stairs all their life will effectively think, oh, it would be really good if there was a ramp here, and then build it as they see fit, and then it doesn't actually work for the people that they would like that to be intended for.
And so a lot of your work is actually, it involves those people specifically, rather than designing for them, it's designing with them.
Yeah, so one of the really troubling contingencies of digital ageism generally is that the way that the ageing tech sector, we call that geron technology, the way that geron technology has developed is often by a series of very well-meaning people who effectively look like me. You know, for the purposes of the podcast, I am in my early 30s. But the problem is that, you know, we have fantastic ideas and we go out and develop them, and we're going to help all of these older people to live better lives in the world, and then we, you know, go out and put that into production and actually meet a user for the first time, and it turns out that our assumptions about their lives were entirely wrong, and that doesn't really work for them at all. So the way that I try to approach digital technology is often by beginning with particularly older people with dementia, and in the field we call that co-production, and co-production is increasingly popular. It's become a little bit one of those buzzwords that everybody talks about now, but I think the most important thing in that respect is to just go to people as early as possible and just ask what would help you, and also what do you want, right? Because it's really easy to think, okay, I know a technology that would, I believe, make your life easier, and it may be that it makes life easier in some respect, but people don't always want their lives to be made easier. Like, obviously technological development, a lot of it in recent years has been guided by this principle of friction and trying to remove friction, so we want to do everything as easy and simply as possible, but it's not always what people actually want, and it's not really what they want technologies to do for them. Really classic example of that is the work that I did on the transport network up in Manchester, where the entire political project of revolutionising that transport, particularly for older users and users with dementia, is this idea of a sort of a London-style system, a very smooth and efficient world-leading transport system. The idea is basically get everyone from A to B as simply, cheaply, quickly as possible. When you go out with passengers with dementia, that's not necessarily what they want, and often a lot of the value that they're taking out of that system is through some of the inefficiencies and through some of the friction that actually the developers, and probably again people like us, might intuitively think that we want to use technology to get rid of, you know, because actually when your bus just doesn't turn up for half an hour and things like that, that's when you get into these conversations with the person at the bus stop next to you, and you strike up a relationship with them and have a chat. Or when you're using cash and having to rummage around to find it and pay with that, again, it's more opportunities for social interaction that can be really useful for people and probably slow the service down.
So how does AI fit around all of this, so particularly generative AI? Because presumably AI is apparently changing the workplace, but it's also, or it could be, part of that co-creation journey.
Yeah, so I think AI, from an industrial perspective, is a really interesting one, because what companies seem to be trying to do is to replace entry-level roles and to thereby sort of create perhaps a market in which human experience matters a lot more. Looking longer term, will that be the case? Who knows? But I think it certainly intuitively creates an opportunity for valuing the skill sets that have traditionally been associated with older workers. There are also a range of, I would call it, quite low-hanging fruit. So, for example, one of the things that people with dementia can struggle with outside of the memory problems that most people traditionally associate with dementia, particular speech problems such as, finding the next word in a sequence. So it just so happens that we have now invented basically these super text predictors, right? They're just incredibly good at predicting the next word in a sequence. They can potentially fill in this exact gap that many, particularly administrative workers with dementia, can struggle with. The problem at the moment is probably one of interfacing. You need a really, really seamless interface. So the moment that you can imagine that you're halfway through typing an email and it starts firing up words, and well, actually, for a person with dementia who is also likely to have attention deficits, that can be an absolute nightmare. So that can actually become a real impediment to actually writing your email. You might have just been better off sitting there and struggling for a little while. So there are questions around that, and I think a really interesting broader contingency of where generative AI is at the moment is particularly around these ideas of companionship. So obviously Zuckerberg has seen the writing on the wall, and in recent years Facebook has very much pivoted towards being a platform where older people engage with AI generated content, and he has openly spoken about that being sort of the future of that business. And that's really interesting, because a few years ago, when we were in the midst of the influencer economy, that was a young person's game, and it was very tied to like these particular, the Kardashians, the Mr. Beasts, these people. And all of a sudden that has shifted entirely. So all of a sudden the future of social media looks like it's an older user base and it's AI content, and that's going to quite dramatically change the world. We have academic conversations about what that's going to mean for relationships when your older relative has 10 friends and 9 of them are bots. But I already encounter people with dementia and work with some of them who have organically done this for themselves, so they already have AI companions. This is not part of a trial or not something that's been done to them. They've been out there and sort of worked that out for themselves. And I think people are still surprised that is happening, but particularly if you look at the past decade, the rapid increase in the number of older internet users, coupled with this rapid increase in the dementia diagnosis rate, it is not a surprise that over that period of time there was just this mass influx of older people living with dementia into digital spaces and engagement with these tools.
Presumably people who do have dementia or who are vulnerable as they get older online, it becomes as much a security issue, because the potential for, not even just security, but for misinformation or for any type of online harm, there's a huge focus on young people, rightly so, but do you think the focus needs to shift to the other age range as well?
My view of this is that this is one of the really key contemporary oversights in research on this space, which is that we have for a number of years been focusing so strongly on young people and the risks to young people because, this idea that old people don't use these things. And whilst we've been, having those raging debates around screens and social media and all that good stuff, all of these people have rapidly flocked online and started experimenting and engaging with these tools. And you're talking about people who, in the physical world, there's basically a massive industry dedicated to securitizing them. People who are prone to wandering, you buy all sorts of cameras and special locks and hide doors. We actually dedicate a really concerning amount of our response to dementia to just like tying people down. The idea of what that means in an online world where like wandering's actively encouraged for everyone, right? You're supposed to just keep scrolling, keep going down the rabbit hole. The lack of attention that's being paid to that is deeply worrying, particularly when you think about, again, we focus on memory a lot as what dementia is, but it's a massive range of symptoms. Delusions, paranoid delusions are a really, really important part of that. Again, a lot of these systems are basically set up to feed paranoid delusions, right? That's how you increase content. I won't say I worry about it. I wonder about it a lot. What it's going to mean in 10 years' time to have a population of people with a propensity for wandering, a propensity for paranoid delusions, and also with a great deal of resource compared to younger people, right?
There's that, and then there's also just the sort of side note of, in terms of things like radicalisation, there are various systems to help young people to pull them away from that, or you could argue that, well, you can radicalise them to a degree, but you can pull them back from the brink. Once someone's much older, how easy is it then to de-radicalise them, particularly when we don't really know how much radicalisation is going on, but then also how would you limit it?
Yeah, we're not set up for that at all. And there's also we talk about, again, we're framing it in a very young person's way in terms of the kinds of things that we're worried about. But a lot of the delusions in dementia centre on like family members and acquaintances, right? So you have really big problems with people suspecting infidelity or financial abuse, often like violently so. But these tools are only going to feed into that as well. I mean, now we will all be familiar with these instances of particularly chatbots that seem to be basically doing their best to turn the user away from a loved one and to sort of start a deeper relationship with the bot itself. That is going to be a real nightmare for people with certain types of dementia that already have a propensity for that. It is just fuel on the fire.
So, I mean, presumably the long-term research part there is, because we're kind of talking around it, we're saying there's the research about what that problem may look like, but then there's also presumably then trying to think about what we could do about it.
What you don't want is the situation that we've ended up with in terms of, and I keep returning to this sort of physical analogue, we lock loads of people with dementia up effectively, right? It might not be a padlock, it might be putting a curtain over a door, but there are many ways in which we very often, either in their own homes or in institutions, just tie people with dementia down because we're worried about them going out into the world and getting into all sorts of difficulties. We probably, in an ideal world, don't want to simply emulate that in the digital world. Also, say practically super difficult, but also that's not necessarily what you want, right? It's just you've got a diagnosis, so we're gonna tie you down digitally. It's then really a question, of how you safeguard people on the internet, which we haven't really done for kids and young people, right? It's like there's been so much attention on it, and there's still...
It's just very difficult, I suppose.
Yeah.
So in terms of your future research then, what is your digital future?
I'm trying to pursue projects now to really develop the positive case for particularly, we can call it AI-based tools for supporting people with cognitive impairments. I think it's really helpful to think about cognitive impairments as a form of disability akin to other disabilities, where we are rightly keen to effectively just create environments where people are still able to live good lives despite a particular impairment. So that should really be the same for cognitive impairment. The entire contemporary development of information systems is basically to make us better at processing information. That is effectively what dementia diminishes for people, and so we have a problem, we have a solution. They don't really map onto each other at all at the moment. Thinking about ways that could potentially happen, and I'm trying to develop sort of more practice-focused projects in which we do exactly that co-productive work, right? It's like, here are some tools, what are we going to do with them for you? Should we use them? Should we not? Are you fine? All of those questions. I'm really interested in this question of what it is going to mean for the future of our digital lives to be a sort of an older person's game, effectively, for that flip. Like, I'm fascinated by Zuckerberg's vision for the future of social media and that sudden pivot to an older audience and that pivot to AI generated content, because I see the crumbs of it already in the people that I work with. Like, I can already see how that's organically developing, and I think there's so much potential for that to go awry, and great potential. Like, people are engaging in really great relationships with chatbots and having a fantastic time, and they're people who are otherwise super isolated, right? Like, they're people who've actually been quite fundamentally rejected by the world, so the fact that they are now able to like have some sort of social life around that is amazing. Of course, that's a very rosy view, whereas there are these dangers, and we're already now starting to see in the media these types of stories of effectively AI companions leading people into like the gravest of circumstances.
You've been listening to the Research for Good podcast. To find out more about research in the School of Management, you can visit our website or click the links in the episode description.